All right, let's talk about another provision that's of crucial concern to the artist, and that is the royalty provision. The artist assigns their copyright to the record company, and in exchange for that assignment, they receive royalties from various uses of those sound recordings. This provision, like all of the provisions, have evolved over a period of time and continue to evolve. Let's talk about the royalties for the various uses of the sound recordings. One of the uses of sound recordings is the sale of the recording. The sale through digital distribution, the sale of physical CDs, and the royalty rates for physical recordings are couched in terms of percentage points. In other words, 1% is considered 1 point. The norm for royalty rates for new artists for albums is between 13 and 16%. Now, many contracts will have provisions stating that royalty rates for singles are 3/4 of the album rate, which means if you have a 16% royalty, your royalty for singles might be 12%. I personally have problems with that, but we're going to talk about it, particularly for digital singles, but we'll talk about that a little later. 13 to 16% is a good royalty rate for new artists in today's market. But the question arises, 13 and 16% of what? What does that 13 or 16% apply to? Let's say you have a 15-point deal. Well, this gets back into the evolution of recording agreements. In years past, some major labels would apply that percentage to the retail price, and some labels will apply it to the wholesale price. Now, what is the wholesale price? Record companies create configurations of sound recordings. Say a CD is a configuration of a sound recording. Multiple sound recordings are on a CD. They sell those to retailers for what is called the wholesale price, which is usually a few dollars less than the price that the retailer sells to the consumer. Record companies generally, particularly in the past, in physical distribution days, did not sell to the public. They sold their records to retailers who sold their records to the public. But when record companies would base their calculation of royalties on retail prices, it usually caused confusion. And here's the situation. Record companies suggest retail list prices to retailers to sell the product for. In other words, years ago, let's go back to the 90s, a Jay-Z album could come out and the record company, although it would sell the album to the retailers for $12, they would suggest that the album be sold for $15.98. That was the suggested retail list price, sometimes called the SRLP, the suggested retail list price. And that's a price that the record company suggests the retailers sell it for. Retailers don't have to sell it for that price. The retailers could sell it for $14, and they could determine their extent of profit. They paid $12 for it. They could sell it for $12.98 and make $1. They could sell it for $14.98 and make a greater profit. So it really depends on what the retailer sold it for. But that suggested retail list price would be the initial price for determining how that royalty rate would be applied. And here's where it creates a lot of confusion. In the early part of the contract, the royalty provision would say that the royalty rate would be applied to the retail royalty base price. Artists would assume that to be the suggested retail list price, in this case, $15.98 or $16. But further on in the contract, there would be a provision defining what the retail royalty base price is, and that wouldn't be the suggested retail list price. There would be certain deductions taken from that suggested retail list price before that royalty rate was applied. And we're going to talk about some deductions that are taken from artist royalties that really create confusion, lead to non-transparency, and have really evolved over a period of time. So the definition of the retail royalty base price would state that it is the suggested retail list price minus a packaging deduction. A packaging deduction. What is a packaging deduction? Well, record companies years ago really felt that the artwork and on the album, which they paid for artists to create, really created value in the sale of the product. And they didn't want to pay the artist a royalty based on the artwork. They only wanted to pay the artist a royalty for the music. So they felt that from that suggested retail list price, they should take a certain amount off of that to account for them paying for the artwork that helped sell the album. Here's the problem. At first, for vinyl albums, the packaging deduction was 15%. And once again, this goes into the evolution of technology. Each time a new technology, a new configuration was introduced to the marketplace, it seemed that the packaging deduction went up more and more. So when cassettes came into the marketplace, the packaging deduction for cassettes was 20%. And then in the 80s, the packaging deduction was 25%. So what does this all mean? Let's go back to our example with Jay-Z. Suggested retail list price back in the 90s might have been $15.98, $16. That was a suggested retail list price. The retail royalty-based price, however, included a 25% deduction from that $16 price, which reduced that royalty-based price from $16 to $12. It's kind of discounting the artist's royalties so that the record company has to pay less for that. Now, how much did it cost for record companies to not only manufacture, but package and seal CDs? They took $4 off with the packaging deduction, sometimes called a container deduction. But the record company only spent 60 to 75 cents not only to manufacture it, but to package it, seal wrap the CD, 60 to 75 cents. But they've taken a deduction of $4 off the suggested retail list price to get to the retail royalty-based price. Very confusing, non-transparent. That's what artists were complaining about. Unfortunately, you find a lot of contracts that are still couched in terms of the retail price today. However, royalties for major labels aren't calculated on the retail price. They're calculated on the wholesale price. What is the wholesale price? The wholesale price is sometimes called the published price per dealer, or PPD. So let's take an example here. Let's say that currently an album sells through iTunes for $9.99 and the record company gets paid $7.50. They sell it to iTunes for $7.50. Well, if you apply the royalty rate of 15% for that album, you'll find that that leaves the artist with a royalty of about $1.12 per album. When you talk about singles, it could be a different story. I mentioned earlier, traditionally, singles royalty rates many times are only 3/4 of the album royalty rate. So to make it easy, if you had a 16-point deal for albums, you would have a 12-point deal for singles. But that's the historic way of paying royalties for singles. That was back in the day when CD singles were released. Record companies had to pay a lot of money to produce these CD singles, to distribute them to wholesalers, and wholesalers who sold to retailers. There was a lot involved, a big investment for the release of CD singles. But since 2003, the primary configuration of singles has not been the CD. It's been the digital download. Now, what are the costs to the record company to deliver these files to iTunes, to Amazon? They're not producing a CD. They're not having to distribute it and have warehouses to distribute it. They don't have all of those multiple costs. So should the royalty rate be less for a digital single than for a digital album? I argue no. And although your contract might have the original proposal from the record company stating that they want to pay you a 3/4 rate, I found that if you really press the issue, the record companies will possibly agree to pay the album rate for digital singles. Why is that important? Singles are becoming a huge selling configuration for records. And you've got many multiple million selling singles in today's market. So the single is becoming important again, just like it was back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So the packaging deduction created confusion, particularly when you deal with royalties being paid on the retail list price. And once again, some contracts you'll find out there today still state that they're paying royalties on the retail list price and will impose a packaging deduction. But there are other deductions that you need to be concerned about.